Arne. I'm one of the partners at FJ Labs. We're a venture fund in New York. We've been around as a fund since 2016, but it's essentially the investment activity of two serial entrepreneurs who have been building marketplaces since the late 90s. And we're very successful doing that. We're angel investors for about 15 years, and then started FJ Labs. And we now have about 700 active investments in the portfolio. About 450 or so of those are marketplace companies. And over the last, call it 3 or 4 years, we've increasingly been investing in the crypto space as well. And we now have coming up on 50 investments in that space. And we're investors in a handful of funds as well in that category. And we think that this is the next frontier of marketplace companies, which is part of the reason that we're investing into it so actively.
Okay, so let's start off with the most basic question. What for you is a Web 3.0 marketplace?
Yeah, so I think it's important to take a little bit of a step back and just explain what we even mean by Web 3. So obviously everybody's familiar with Web 1 and 2. Web 1, you had the static content put up by someone who hosted a website, and you didn't really have any two-way communication. And then Web 2, you started getting the two-way communication, you got user-generated content, you got the social media platforms, newspapers started having comment sections on their website, you got Twitter. But all of this in both of these phases was centralized. What's new now with Web 3 is that we're moving into a much more decentralized world where data is living in many computers around the world. Everybody obviously is familiar with blockchain, the open public ledger that sort of underpins all of these different technologies. And that enables a much more resistant, much more tamper-proof economy in very many different ways. Everything from storing value like Bitcoin to intelligent or smart contracts with Ethereum, also including the recent fad with NFTs, which I do think is a massive, powerful tool, but maybe not seeing its full potential quite yet.
Can we dive down that rabbit hole for a second?
Yeah, of course.
Why do you think NFTs are a fad?
I don't think they're a fad. I think the current incarnation of NFTs is probably not sustainable.
Okay.
If you look at the value of some of the things that people are buying, I think they're ascribing a lot of value to things that probably don't have that high level of sort of fundamental value. Yes. Because they're essentially access to communities that people are very passionate about. And I think we are going to see a significant correction in the value that people put on these tokens. But I do think that the fundamental technology is still very, very important. So if you look at NBA Top Shots, for instance, it's essentially collectible basketball cards. Mm-hmm. But what's super interesting about it is that the technology enables you to do royalties of secondary sales. So for the NBA, they've now discovered a revenue stream where every time these cards resell, a part of the proceeds from that sale goes back to the NBA and goes back to the players. So you can continue a recurring stream of revenue, whereas in the past, you got revenue when you sold the initial card, but after that, every subsequent transaction would go fully between the buyer and seller. So I think you open up some very interesting new business models, and we're going to see a massive adoption of NFTs across the board. But I think a lot of the sort of current JPEGs that people are paying tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars for, is probably going to deflate.
So you're not a fan of Bored Apes and mutant Bored Apes?
I wish I had a Bored Ape, and I have a lot of NFTs, and I'm very fascinated about the space, but I do think that we're probably going to see.
So you're not going to Ape Fest in 2 weeks?
I am not.
Okay. So,
but I am going to NFT NYC.
Okay. So then the next question related to that is then how does this whole Web 3.0 relate to marketplaces? You know, what's fundamentally going to change for the world out there for as we know marketplaces today?
Totally. So I think there's a couple of things that are substantially different. So in Web 2, it's centralized. You have a lot of managed marketplaces that can do a lot in the transaction to make it smoother, make it easier for the user. And you're quite hands-on, and it costs you a fair amount of money, so it only works if your transactions are big enough or you have high enough recurrence to really make that fly. The challenge with marketplaces in Web 2 is that you have to invest a lot of money in user acquisition. You have to go to Facebook or Instagram or Google or TikTok and invest money into acquiring users, both on your supply side and your demand side. Obviously, if you're building a B2B marketplace, it's probably more going to be sales, but you're investing a lot in user acquisition to get to a meaningful enough scale that you can match your buy side and sell side and get to liquidity. In Web3, this equation is shifting. So people are starting with building core communities where people have a shared passion or a shared interest in something. And they're investing, as opposed to marketing, they're investing in community managers, in things that attract people, retain them, and keep them engaged. And a lot of these communities live in Discord, which was originally built for gaming. And people talk about these projects. They start building features for the project almost organically. So tack-ons to the tool are often built by the community. So instead of investing a lot of money in direct sort of performance acquisition or aggressive SEO strategies, which are obviously also going to play a role in Web3, companies are putting a lot more emphasis on building that initial early community, which I think is quite different from Web 2.
So Web 2 is all about AdWords, get as much traffic as you possibly can and hope like hell something converts. Web 3.0 is engaging with the audience as a community beyond just getting them to buy a car or a house or whatever the marketplace is offering.
Right.
It's saying, how do I build something more powerful around that and having them participate in the discussion? But do you think you should then, the part of the whole Web 3.0 community stuff is these DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations.
Right.
Do you want to outsource the running of your business to your audience?
So I think most of the DAOs start centralized. So you start with a central group that is running the company and that is setting the direction of the company. And then over time, you gradually involve your community in your decision-making process. Some of them do this via tokens, like everybody in the community gets a token. They might do a separate governance token, which is directly related to the DAOs. And then they start with easy decisions to make sure that they don't completely derail the project, but can still have a say. And then as the community progresses, gets more robust and sort of proves that it has the serious well-being of the marketplace as their primary priority, they gradually give them more and more power over decisions. And in some of the big crypto projects, you're seeing that a lot of the very, very important governance decisions are completely left up to holders based on ownership in the community, which of course can be dangerous and leave you open to attacks if someone buys too much ownership of your project. But if you have a big enough, distributed enough owner base of a project, I think you can be quite well protected.
But aren't these owners of tokens just shareholders at the end of the day and helping set the direction
I
of
mean,
the
shareholders have a lot more legal protections, I think, than token holders.
Yes.
So to some extent, yes, but it also really depends on how much power the founders of the project are willing to give up to others over time.
So if you're running a marketplace today,
Yeah.
and you're looking at this 3.0 world,
Yeah.
what would you do, right? It doesn't matter really what the marketplace is. It's at the end of the day, it's finding a buyer and a seller and matching them and monetizing that process.
Right.
How would you then embrace Web 3.0 and how would you then think about starting to push some of the decision making out to the audience?
In terms of how I would start it and how I would approach it differently in Web3?
Yeah.
So I think there's a few different things in Web3 that can be quite powerful when you're starting a new platform. So one is, again, everybody's familiar with the blockchain, I assume, which is just an open public ledger where you can see every transaction that has ever happened. You may not know who was transacting with who because that's anonymized, but you can see every transaction. And part of what's interesting about that is, again, the user acquisition side of things. Because if you're in Web 2, you can go to Facebook, you can build a lookalike audience, and you can try to target people who are similar to the people that you know buy your product, and hopefully have better conversion on that. In Web 3, you can go on the blockchain and you can look for the people who have done exactly what you're looking for. So for instance, if
You're
you're
talking about like the same transaction.
yeah, so if we take the NFT world as an example, OpenSea is the biggest player. They've done an insane amount of volume. I think they're now doing $30–40 million of transaction a day. They're the behemoth in the space. In January, a different company called LooksRare launched. And what they did was that they essentially looked at everyone who had ever transacted on OpenSea, and then they gave free tokens to everyone who had done that. So everybody suddenly just woke up to a number of tokens in their wallet that was worth thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars, which obviously made them very aware, very curious about LooksRare, and pulled them into that platform. So now you've attracted users that care about exactly what you're doing, buying and selling NFTs. They come to your platform, and then you can use the tokens as incentives to get them to do what you want. So first, they ask people to stake their tokens, which is kind of akin to vesting. So you lock it to the platform, you can't sell it for a period of time, and for doing that, you get rewarded with additional tokens. And then beyond that, they started incentivizing people to buy and trade on LooksRare as opposed to OpenSea by giving them a higher share of fees and a share of all the fees of everybody else who transacts on the platform as well. So you continue to accrue more of these tokens, you get more and more loyal to the platform. And then over time, they've gotten more and more finessed in their tokenomics. So now they are incentivizing people to list their items closer and closer to the market clearing price. So what's called floor price in the NFT world, which obviously increases the likelihood that people will actually buy it because it's more fairly priced, if you will. So all of these incentives that you can play around with because of the tokens, I think are very, very interesting in both attracting, retaining, and sort of manipulating behavior in a marketplace.
Okay. Before we go on to the next question, Bruce, could you bring up Slido just to have there? Because you mean this is a fundamentally interesting topic, and one I think that we look at and we hear the words, and there's more buzzwords, everything from floor price through to DAOs and whatever, right?
Right.
And you look at them and you scratch your head and you realize that they're just other words for things that you know every day.
Right.
But I think understanding, because this is how the younger generation is engaging, and you know, right now there's consensus happening in Austin, right? There's another conference, and there's, I don't know how many people are going there, but there's a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. Thousands be going there. And there are these conferences everywhere, and everyone is, and we're at this sort of interesting early adoption, and now we're waiting for the main part of the adoption curve to be hit.
Right.
That's when it's going to really impact all our businesses, I think, in a very fundamental way, which is why I wanted to have these sort of topics engaged in you know, on the agenda. But let's just do something. Let's get something very practical. Like, you know, how do you think there's a link between a property portal and like the metaverse?
So I think a lot of this is still unknown, just to be totally candid. I think this is going to be adopted in waves, and we're kind of in the very, very early innings of the Apple App Store. It took a while before people started discovering the business models that worked, and how do you do effective user acquisition? How do you do effective user monetization? And like the supercells and the kings of the world came a few years later when all of these things had been figured out and people were getting smarter about this. I think for a property portal, for like really expensive real world assets, you need to build such a level of trust that I think the metaverse and crypto is probably a little bit too early in the adoption curve. Right now, like if you look at the NFT space, there's about 400,000 active users on OpenSea. That's not a very large number if you look at the bigger scheme of marketplaces in the world. Now, the adoption is very fast, the volume is very high, but I think we're still very much in that very early adopter phase of the market. And I think the bigger the value of the transaction, the longer it will take before we get there because of the trust element.
I think so. You know, let's have a look at this one. Do you think on the short term that we'll see house flippings with NFTs?
Yeah, I think the same. I have the same challenge there because I think the trust element is missing. And also, when you're dealing with physical, real-world assets, you need to somehow link them. You need to link the off-chain value, the property, with an on-chain item or an NFT or whatever it is you're transacting. So what we're starting to see is that some players are building data offering on the blockchain. So like Parcel is an example of a company that is trying to build essentially a grid showing the development of prices in real estate in different sectors, and you can buy into that. You can essentially make bets on which direction prices in different neighborhoods will go. So it's almost like a betting market for real estate price development, where you can get rewarded for being right and punished for being wrong. So I think you see some of these things, but when you're trying to connect off-chain and on-chain, it gets tricky. We looked at a company recently called WineChain, which I think is a super interesting business that is trying to link wine and NFTs. So you can buy an NFT for a very rare and expensive bottle of wine. But when you do that, the bottle is kept in storage by the company. So you can't access it. And then I can sell my NFT to you, so now the bottle in storage belongs to you. But if you take it out of storage to drink the wine, your NFT gets burned. And the purpose of that mechanism is to make sure that you link the off-chain and the on-chain asset, which I think is much harder to do in real estate, at least for now.
But it's about ownership at the end of the day. It's about confirming ownership, and you have the right to sell something. It's not stolen. It's not fraudulent. It's like, and I may assume watches will eventually come with NFTs attached to them in some form.
I'm sure they will. I think it's just a matter of time. And I think the challenge is, how do you create that link in a way that people can trust it and know that when I buy this NFT, I also get the deed to your house?
Yes.
Like, you need to create that link somehow to establish that trust. And I'm not sure we're quite there.
Right. But we are heading down that path. I mean, I had lunch the other day with someone who's a listed company involved in the space, and you know, they said, look, this is like internet in 1999, right? He said, you don't understand. We don't know what problems we're really solving. We just know we're solving problems.
100%.
Right? And they're building technology, they're building infrastructure. In this case, they're into the underlying payment systems for on-ramping and off-ramping. I learned so many jargon words in that.
And that's where we've put most of our money. Like, most of our investments over the past 4 years have gone into infrastructure. On-ramps, off-ramps, exchanges. We've invested in localized OpenSea type platforms for different geos. Like, we've invested in one that's focused on the Hispanic community out of Argentina. And I think that those underpinnings, that infrastructure layer that you need in order to build end consumer applications on top, is where most of the investment has been in the last few years, and I think it probably will remain that way for a few more.
Yeah, the way I was trying to have an interesting conversation with my son, who evidently knows a lot about it, as he tells me, I said, do you want to invest in the cars? If you don't know which car is going to be successful or not, or do you want to invest in the road? Because the reality is, they're all going to drive up and down the road.
Exactly.
And I think the light went on for him, because he said, okay. And then he wants to understand more about it. When we think about this, though, right, we're in this whole concept of roads and what are you investing in and so on, there's not a lot of regulation.
No.
Right. And so how do you think about government stepping in and going, wait a second, there's a bit of the Wild West happening here.
Yep.
There's what was it, the tether, US tether, whatever it was, going the other day.
The UST and Luna, yeah.
Yeah, Luna going from $1 for $1 to nothing for $1.
Yeah,
in a
heartbeat. Steep fall.
And the underlying infrastructure is just not being managed, and people are losing serious amounts of money.
Yep.
How do you think governments are going to step in to start to manage this? Not only because they want to protect people, because they actually want to get their cut of the tax.
Right.
That's sort of avoiding at the moment.
So, I mean, on the tax side, the US government has been pretty forward-leaning, and the Biden administration has hired a lot of people to focus on crypto taxes to manage that. And there's a lot of technology solutions that are being built now that makes this quite feasible, because, again, all of the transactions are on-chain. As long as you can tie a wallet to a person, you can see every transaction that they've done, and it's very easy to build that tax report with the right tools. So I think that one is very easy. When you look at crypto more overall, I think it's a very nebulous thing to try to regulate. It's it's touching a lot of very different things. And some of the key things that are being built in crypto, if you look at DeFi, sort of decentralized finance as a broad category, is going directly into something that the SEC obviously cares about very deeply. Like, is this a security? Is it not a security? How do you define a security?
Yes.
And it's a very tricky balance for a regulator, because on one hand, you want to make sure that the innovation continues to happen in the US. Like, you want to be at the forefront of what could potentially be the next major sort of internet-style revolution. So you don't want to throttle and completely kill innovation. And at the same time, you want to try to make sure that it happens in a way that protects consumers. And I think it's too early for me to really opine on where the US regulator or other regulators are really going to step in. But what we're seeing is that they're starting to punish bad actors. So in the NFT space, just to go back to that, there was a community manager in OpenSea who was caught front-running the collections that were featured on the OpenSea homepage. So, and this is again the beauty of the ledger, someone realized that before they published collections on the homepage of OpenSea, he would buy those collections himself, then he would post it on the homepage, and then he would sell it based on the hype that happened on the front page. And he has now been arrested. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of that behavior, but it's very hard to see like where the regulators will and will not try to bring this back under control.
So the beauty of this is it's hyper-transparent.
Yes.
You can see absolutely everything. As long as you know someone's address, you can go in there and you can use the Ethereum site to go in there and see all the transactions that's gone, what they've bought, what they've sold, at what price,
exactly.
all the gas fees they've paid at whatever point in time. And I think it's that transparency that's going to change a lot of the ways in which people interact, because they will know for sure that this property is real. Once
Right.
they've worked out how to attach something to that property, they'll know that that car is actually legitimate, has, there's been the taxes or whatever's paid, and the serial numbers all match up, and so on.
And I think the next wave of this might be that they will try to connect the individual to one address and make it essentially soul-bound, so it's tied to you as an individual and you cannot change it. Yeah. Which will hurt some of the privacy elements, but will do a lot to establish trust.
Yeah, and I think in this world that trust will gazump privacy. Okay, I think, and people, as much as they want privacy, let's get used to it. Everything's going to be super transparent. So thank you very much. Thank you, Arne, for talking about this. I think it's a super interesting topic, and I would encourage everyone to invest time in this area, because it's not going away, and it has the potential to fundamentally change the way in which your businesses operate and in which you will operate out there, and get a wallet, right, and start collecting NFTs.
100%.
And try to get an ape. Okay. Thank you very much, Arne.
Thank you very much for having me.
Excellent.